There is one mistake almost everyone makes when they look at the oil crisis caused by the war with Iran. They ask the wrong question. They ask, when will the Strait of Hormuz reopen? That question matters, but it is not enough. The better question is this: what has already been broken that reopening the strait will not immediately fix, because the world is acting as if the crisis has a simple switch. Closed waterway, high prices; open waterway, normal prices; war continues, crisis continues; war ends, crisis ends. That is not how the energy system works. The energy system is not a door, it is a machine. And when a machine this large is forced to stop, slow down, reroute, ensure ration, store, shut wells, delay shipments, and replace supply under panic conditions, the damage moves through the system long after the first headline disappears. That is why this moment is so dangerous. The war has created an oil shock, but the oil shock is only the visible part. Underneath it are three larger shocks, now moving together: a cost of living shock, a food shock, and a confidence shock in the old global order. Let me start with the first one, because it is the one every ordinary person understands before politicians do. Oil is not only gasoline. Oil is motion. It moves trucks, it moves ships, it moves planes, it moves farm equipment, it moves mining equipment, it moves the materials that become everything else. When oil becomes expensive or uncertain, the price does not stay inside the energy sector. It spreads into almost everything people buy. That is why a crisis in Hormuz can show up in the price of bread, in bus fares, in airline tickets, in factory costs, in school schedules, in government budgets, and in the anger of people who never once looked at a map of the Persian Gulf before the war. The Strait of Hormuz was one of the quiet assumptions of modern life. Roughly 1/5 of daily global oil consumption moved through it. The world did not think about it because it worked. That is how infrastructure becomes invisible. It disappears from attention until it fails. Then suddenly, everyone discovers that a narrow corridor near Iran is connected to their grocery bill. That is what has happened. Now, the Strait of Hormuz has stopped being background infrastructure. It has become the center of the global cost of living crisis. And the shock is especially brutal because it does not hit countries equally. Some countries have reserves, some have domestic production, some have alternative suppliers, some have renewables at scale, some have deep pockets. Others have none of those things. Look at Asia. Japan imports almost all its oil and depends heavily on the Gulf. South Korea is deeply exposed. The Philippines is almost completely dependent on imported oil from the region. Southeast Asian economies with smaller fiscal cushions cannot simply buy their way through a prolonged spike. When fuel becomes scarce or expensive there, governments do not have the luxury of pretending. They shorten work weeks, they cut school days, they ask workers to stay home, they reduce transport, they ration, they make emergency decisions that tell you the crisis has already entered daily life. This is how an oil shock becomes social pressure, and once social pressure begins, it does not wait politely for diplomats. Europe is exposed in a different way. It may not receive most of its crude directly through Hormuz, but Europe still buys into the same world price. That is the cruel logic of a global commodity. You do not have to stand near the fire to feel the heat if everyone around you is suddenly competing for the same limited supply. If Asia pays more for substitute barrels, Europe pays more too. If insurance premiums rise, shipping costs rise for everyone. If Gulf production is disrupted, every refinery and importer in the world has to recalculate. The United States is not immune either. American politicians love the phrase energy independence because it sounds like a shield. But a slogan does not repeal a global price. The United States imports millions of barrels per Dalton Y. American refiners, airlines, truckers, farmers, and consumers all live inside a global market. When the world price rises, America pays through the same system everyone else does. That is the first shock. The second shock is food. This is the part that may prove more dangerous because it arrives with a delay. Energy crises are visible immediately. Food crises are planted before they are seen. The Gulf region is deeply tied to the fertilizer supply chain. Fertilizer is not a luxury. It is one of the hidden foundations of modern food production. If farmers cannot get enough fertilizer during planting season, the result does not appear the next morning. It appears months later in smaller harvests. That delay creates false comfort. People look around and say, the shelves are still full, the restaurants are still open, the food system is fine, but crops do not care about headlines. If the inputs were missing during the season when they were needed, the harvest later tells the truth, and when the harvest disappoints, the price shock moves from fuel to food. Poor countries are hit first. They spend more of household income on basic necessities. They have less fiscal capacity to subsidize fuel and food. They cannot outbid wealthier nations in commodity markets. When global traders choose where to send scarce supply, money speaks louder than need. That is how a geopolitical conflict becomes hunger, not through one dramatic announcement, but through a chain of practical constraints. Fertilizer disrupted, planting weakened, harvest reduced, food prices rise, import-dependent countries suffer, governments panic, public anger grows. That is why the Hormuz crisis cannot be measured only in barrels. It has to be measured in future meals. The third shock is confidence. This may be the biggest one long term. For decades, the global energy system rested on a few assumptions. Hormuz would remain open, Gulf energy would flow, oil would be priced mostly in dollars, the United States would remain the central military power around critical sea lanes. Countries would tolerate dollar dependence because the system was inconvenient to replace but reliable enough to keep. This war is testing every one of those assumptions at the same time. Iran's decision to close or restrict Hormuz did not only threaten oil supply, it challenged the belief that the most important choke point in the world would always remain stable. The demand that friendly countries settle oil in yuan did not only create a diplomatic headline, it challenged the quiet habit of pricing global energy in dollars. The resulting panic did not only raise prices, it encouraged countries to reconsider the architecture underneath their dependence. That is where China becomes important. China is hurt by this crisis. Anyone saying otherwise is selling fantasy. China is the largest oil importer in the world. Its industrial base needs energy. A long disruption in Hormuz is painful, but China also prepared for pain. It built strategic petroleum reserves, it diversified suppliers, it increased purchases when prices were lower, it expanded ties with Russia and Central Asia, it built overland routes, it invested in the China-Pakistan corridor, it became the global leader in solar batteries. And electric vehicles, those moves were not just environmental, they were strategic. China looked at oil choke points and saw vulnerability. It saw that sea lanes could be pressure points. It saw that dependence on imported crude was not just an economic issue, but a national security risk. So it spent years reducing the leverage those choke points could give others. That does not make China invincible. It makes China less surprised. And in a crisis, being less surprised is power. The countries that assumed the old energy system would always function are now scrambling. The countries that built reserves and alternatives are absorbing the shock better. That difference will shape the next stage of global power more than speeches at summits ever could. Because energy security is not only about who has oil, it is about who can endure disruption. The same logic applies to money. The petrodollar system has been one of the deepest pillars of American power. Global oil priced in dollars creates constant demand for dollars. Those dollars move back into American assets that supports U.S. financial debt borrowing capacity and global influence. But every crisis teaches countries to ask whether dependence is safe. If dollar settlement can be disrupted by war, sanctions, naval blockades, or political pressure, countries begin looking for alternatives. Not because alternatives are perfect, they are not. The yuan is not ready to replace the dollar in one clean move. No serious person should pretend otherwise. But replacement is not the only form of change. Diversification is change. A little more trade in yuan, a few more bilateral energy deals outside the dollar, a few more payment systems built to avoid Western financial channels, a few more countries holding different reserves, a few more producers willing to settle outside the old framework. That is how a dominant system starts to lose its monopoly. The danger for the United States is not that the dollar disappears tomorrow. It is that the world practices using other options during every crisis. And the Hormuz shock gives the world another practice session. That is why this war has consequences beyond the battlefield. It is not only damaging Iran, it is not only raising oil prices, it is training countries to think differently about energy, currency, reserves, food, and strategic dependence. Once countries begin thinking differently, they do not simply forget. This is where the comparison to the 1970s becomes so important. The 1970s oil shocks changed politics, economics, inflation, central banking, industrial policy, and household behavior. They reshaped assumptions. They taught a generation that cheap energy was not guaranteed and that inflation could return in forms governments were not prepared to manage. The current crisis risks doing something similar, but in a world more financially fragile and more geopolitically divided. Debt levels are higher, supply chains are more complex, trust between major powers is lower. Domestic politics are more unstable. Households are already tired from previous inflation. Central banks are already struggling to balance growth and prices. That makes a new stagflation shock especially dangerous. If energy and food prices rise while growth slows, policymakers face an ugly choice. Raise interest rates to fight inflation and risk deeper recession, cut rates to support growth and risk feeding inflation, subsidize households and widen deficits, do nothing and watch public anger grow. There is no clean answer. That is why the real cost of this war may arrive in waves. The first wave is oil, the second wave is food, The third wave is inflation. The fourth wave is political pressure. The fifth wave is a deeper shift away from the old assumptions that held the energy dollar order together. And this is the lesson people should take from Hormuz. A choke point is not dangerous only because ships pass through it. A choke point is dangerous because assumptions pass through it. The assumption that energy will be available, assumption that trade will remain smooth, the assumption that inflation can be managed, the assumption that the dollar system will always be the default, the assumption that a regional war will stay regional, all of those assumptions are now under pressure. And once assumptions break, they do not repair as quickly as pipelines. So when people ask whether the Strait of Hormuz will reopen, I understand the question, it matters. But the better question is whether the world that depended on Hormuz without thinking about it can return to the way it was before. I am not sure it can, because this crisis has revealed something that cannot be unseen. The global economy is not as strong as it looked when oil was cheap and shipping was easy. It is a chain of dependencies disguised as normal life. One narrow waterway tightens, and suddenly countries debate rationing. Farmers worry about fertilizer, families worry about food, central banks worry about stagflation, governments worry about unrest, and major powers quietly test payment systems outside the dollar. That is not a local crisis, that is a global warning. The world built itself around the assumption that Hormuz would keep working. Now, Hormuz has shown everyone what happens when it does not, and the bill is only beginning to arrive.